And let's talk about the Chagos Islands, otherwise known as the British Indian Ocean Territory. Now, what I'd like to do here is to give you some, firstly, put it into geographical perspective so you know what we're talking about. Then I want to give you some history, which goes right back, because the Chagos Islands and Mauritius were French colonies, which we took over from the French during the Napoleonic Wars. Okay. And we, until 1968, we controlled Mauritius. It was a British colony. It was part of the British Empire up until 1968. But I'll get into that in a minute. And then I want to tell you why there's been this drive to change the sovereignty over to Mauritius. And it's all based upon legal opinions from the UN, which are not actually binding at all. And we're going to distribute blame equally to the Tories and to the Labour, because believe it or not, it was this lady who started it all. This is a book which I'm reading. It's called 10 Years to Save the West. I've read this much. So we're on to the final stretch here, and we still haven't got down to what's necessary to save the West. So I'm not expecting it's going to be particularly much. Actually, I know what it is. She's like some of these kind of boomer conservatives who believe that the big threat to the West is like Iran and China and Russia, completely living in a different planet, quite frankly. But she started it. She started the discussions with Mauritius, unfortunately. A fact she has not mentioned and does not appear in the index either. But she was the one that got this ball rolling. Wasn't her finest decision. Anyway, let's look at the map to show you where the British Indian Ocean Territory is. Let's bring up the first one. Now that's looking down there, right in the center of that picture. You can see British Indian Ocean Territory. It's not very big. And southwest, the first island you'll get to is Mauritius. And it's Mauritius which is claiming to have some kind of sovereignty over that territory, also known as the Chagos Archipelago. Now, the distance there is it's over 1,300 miles. So it's not exactly within walking distance or even swimming distance. Okay, let's go to the next pic. Now, this is the Chagos Archipelago, or the British Indian Ocean Territory, in more detail. Now, the brown bits, which you can just see, are the actual dry land bits. The lighter blue is reef areas, much of which are underwater, and the darker blue is submerged reef. Now, down in the bottom right-hand corner there, you'll see really what it's all about. Diego Garcia, which is the biggest island of the archipelago, and presently is the only one that's inhabited. And it's inhabited by US Air Force personnel, because if we move to the next picture, you'll see there, it's a very unusual island, elongated in that sense. And it's really just a landing strip. It's really just a landing strip for aircraft. And it's largely the Americans that use it, but of course the British also, if we happen to be in that area. So it's a very strategic positioned island, because if we move to the next picture, you'll see it's slap bang there in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and it's within flying distance of all of these areas from Somalia to Yemen to to the 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 Strait of Hormuz, which is up there in the top left-hand corner. That's the at the moment, that's very much an important area because that's where the ships go through to get to the Suez Canal. So the Americans and British always want to be within flying distance of that kind of thing because, I mean, there's problems at the moment kicking off there as we know. Um, and then it's close to India. It's only like 1,000 miles or so from the tip of India, and it's out to the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan, obviously a very contested area, East Timor, and then flying distance to Australia and so on. So I mean, it's a very important air base, and indeed many of Britain's overseas territories are extremely geostrategic, as they say. Okay. We'll just get rid of that thing there. So that's it's an important military base, if nothing else. Now it has, of course, a checkered history, and let me just basically bring you up to speed with that. Now, there's two histories here. There's the history of Mauritius, which is presently claiming to have sovereignty over it, and there's the history of the actual archipelago, the Chagos Archipelago itself. And let's start with Mauritius history. Now, Mauritius is not a big island, it's just a small island, and it was first populated back in 1507 by Portuguese sailors who came upon it and didn't do very much with it. And then the Dutch in 1598 started to inhabit it. And they tried to establish a colony of people on Mauritius, but struggled to do so. And they left the island in 1710. Unfortunately, the Portuguese, when they had arrived, had brought in Manak monkeys. And what happened, believe it or not, is the Manak monkeys actually colonized the island. They got so numerous and so aggressive that they basically drove out the humans. That sounds like a tall tale, but apparently that's so, because of all these like literally strange like monkeys literally just scaring everybody constantly all the time. So by 1715, the French had come along, and I don't know what they did with the monkeys, probably shot them all or something like that. But they took over the island from 1715 and tried to again populate it with people. And they changed its name. The Portuguese had, no, the French had, sorry, the Dutch had given it the name Mauritius. But the French changed the name of Mauritius simply to the Isle of France. But by the beginning of the 1800s, you had the Napoleonic Wars, Britain against France, and Mauritius was controlled by France. Britain invaded Mauritius in 1810 and took the place over. And then in 1814, the British also took the Chagos Islands off the French as well, as a consequence of the Treaty of Paris. So these two island groups, Mauritius and the Chagos Archipelago, they had been controlled by France, but the Napoleonic Wars delivered them into the hands of the British. And the British administered both of these areas as part of the British Empire. And because the Chagos Islands was largely very difficult to populate and there was nothing really there much at all, they simply administered the Chagos Islands from their colony of Mauritius and continued to administer the Chagos Islands from Mauritius until the 1960s, when post-World War II, what you were facing was the decolonization movement throughout the world. And the Mauritians began kicking off and wanting independence. And the British could see the writing on the wall, and they knew that sooner or later the British would have to get out of Mauritius. So what we did quite cleverly was we thought, well, what about the Chagos Islands? They're also ours, as it were. So we're going to set the Chagos Islands free of Mauritius, and we're going to set the Chagos Islands up as a separate entity in and of itself, a separate British sovereign colony that we'll control. So they did that in 1965. The Chagos Islands got administrative independence from Mauritius and were just set up as a British colony in and of itself, called the British Indian Ocean Territory. And then what happened in Mauritius in 3 years later was a democratic election was held, and the Mauritius Independence Party won. And so in 1968, the British left Mauritius, and Mauritius became an independent part of the Crown Commonwealth, with the Queen as head of state. And she stayed head of state, as it happened, until 1992, when it became a republic. But by 1968, the people in Mauritius were like, well, there you go. Where's the Chagos Islands? Oh, they're still over there, 1,300 miles away. But guess what? We don't have any control over them anymore, because 3 years ago, the British made them basically a sovereign, separate colony. And that's always grated on the Mauritians. And they've always said, well, it was administered, the Chagos was administered by the British when they were in Mauritius. Now that the British have left, surely we should be able to administer the Chagos Islands. Well, sorry, you can't, because before you got your so-called independence, we made the Chagos Islands separate from Mauritius. So that was at least some clever thinking, unbelievably clever thinking of the British diplomats at the time. Unusually clever thinking, actually, to foresee that. Because if you know one thing about British post-war diplomats, they're all just bloody idiots, excuse me. But for that one, they actually figured something out there, which was really quite remarkable when you think of it. So ever since then, ever since 1968, the Mauritians have been, those should come to us. And they've got a kind of argument. But we've also got an argument as well. And so it's really just two different points of view as far as that's concerned. My own view, of course, is that they absolutely do belong to Britain, and they've only ever existed in any real sense under British rule in one way or another. Now, the story does get a little bit morally complicated, because between 1968 and 1973, we had this deal with the Americans to build that great big airstrip that you saw earlier. And that required shifting out the people who actually lived there at the time. And you could say they were forcibly removed. And you could say that was wrong, and there's certainly an argument for that. And I don't want to get into that at the moment. I just do want to make sure that you're aware that the Chagos Islanders were moved out either to the Maldives or to the Seychelles, or indeed about quite a few hundred were actually moved to Britain, where their ancestors still exist to this day. So that's the history of how that came about. Now, the question is, why today? Why today are we being expected to give back, inverted commas, the Chagos Islands to Mauritius? What's pushing that? What's the policy? What's the politics behind that? Well, it comes as a consequence of 3 rulings which have been made in United Nations courts. And I want to get into those briefly at the moment. But I do want to point out that these rulings that have been made are not binding rulings upon us. They don't demand that we do it. They're simply advisory rulings, matter of opinion rulings, as it were, that we in Britain don't actually have any reason to follow if we don't want to. There's not a country in the world that has to follow UN advisory rulings, even binding rulings at the end of the day. If it's international law, it's really just very much up to the country whether they want to follow it or not. But you certainly have no reason to follow advisory rulings. And it's not just me saying that. Let me bring up this lawyer who's written the best article that's out there on this very fact. This is from Jurist News, and it's written by Professor Elliot Winter from Newcastle University, and this is dated 12th of December 2024, and it's a three-part series, and the author is the international law professor at Newcastle University, argues that Britain's planned surrender of the strategically vital Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius is legally unnecessary, as none of the international decisions cited as justification are actually binding on the United Kingdom. As the author has previously explained, and this is in part 1 of his 3-part article, this is part 2 that I'm reading from at the moment, the intended surrender of the Chagos would represent a major strategic blow to Western security. Moreover, the plan offers no discernible benefit to the British people or to the Chagosian islanders, many of whom have come out in protest against it. In practice, the UK seems to be making this concession based on fear of negative future court judgment, with the Foreign Secretary opining that a binding judgment against the UK seemed inevitable. However, the source of such a putative future judgment has not been specified. Surely, if any court with the ability to produce such a binding judgment had been available, Mauritius would have already availed itself of that court. And this is important stuff because many of us need to know what's going on here, and this is the definitive article on it. As he says, as Professor Winter says, instead, the legal position of the British government should be based on existing legal circumstances. As this article will show, there is no binding legal judgment compelling the UK to relinquish sovereignty of the Chagos Archipelago. Here's the juice here. The adverse statements rendered by the International Court of Justice, the United Nations General Assembly, and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea were respectively 1. Non-binding legal advice, 2. Political assertion, and 3. A judgment on the territorial boundary between other states, namely Mauritius and the Maldives. And the result is that the UK is not bound by any of their terms. And he goes in at some length to speaking about this, which I don't need to cover, but we will put the link to that under the description box when we have finished this video. And he concludes down here, he concludes, sovereignty over the Chagos has been the subject of a long dispute between the UK and Mauritius. A narrative is beginning to form that the combination of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, the UN General Assembly resolution, and the International Law of the Sea Special Chamber decision somehow furnish Mauritius with a solid claim to sovereignty over the island chain. This narrative is flawed. None of the decisions discussed above impose a binding legal obligation on the UK to vacate sovereignty. The ICJ opinion is advisory only. The UN General Assembly resolution is a quote-unquote recommendation, and the international law of the sea proceedings did not involve the UK, and therefore do not have the capacity to bind the UK. For the UK to relinquish sovereignty based on a false narrative that lacks the foundation of an unenforceable legal judgment would be an error. There you go, from Professor Elliot Winter, who we have to thank for putting together this three-part series, which explains the law in its entirety and which explains the law very clearly. So Starmer and his people will know all of that. So why this rush, this dirty rush to give up what was described there as a vital strategic asset for the United Kingdom and indeed the wider Western world? Why give it up to Mauritius, which, at the risk of sounding like Liz Truss here, is certainly friendly with China, if nothing else? So, well, let's not lay it all at the door of Starmer. Liz Truss began the discussions with Mauritius when she attended a UN meeting during her brief tenure. Then James Cleverly, who was the Foreign Secretary, took it forward. And yesterday, and this is James Cleverly, a Tory at the time of the Truss-Sunak governments, he took it forward. And we've got something from James Cleverly here, who was on Twitter last night trying to have a go at Starmer. And he goes, as Foreign Secretary, I was tasked with initiating talks with Mauritius. I was always clear that we had red lines that we would not compromise over. It looks like Labour dropped these red lines to get a rushed deal last year, and now it gets even worse. And then he goes on to try to justify that he was trying to get a good deal and Labour are getting a bad deal. And if you go underneath all of his tweets there, you'll see that everybody is asking him, who on earth tasked you with initiating such talks? Why were you initiating such talks? None of which he explains. In fact, we put out a tweet as well, just following that. Cleverly, we say, makes it clear that Labour are just finishing what the Tories started, albeit with some technical differences. The fact is that neither of these two parties are fit for patriotic and sovereign British government. Okay, because that's the problem that we face in this country. Our politicians do not put British sovereignty first, whether that's British by sovereignty, I mean authority, complete authority. They don't put that first. They don't put British interests first, whether that's on the economy, whether that's on foreign policy, whether that's on immigration. It's never what's good for Britain. It's always doing something that some globalist institution like the UN has recommended, or in bed with foreign countries that we shouldn't be in bed with, but we think that is politically correct to be in bed with them. They never just put Britain first. And that's what's so frustrating about the establishment in Britain. And it's been like that for a very long time. We would need to go back. Well, how far would we need to go back to find a British politician who is a sovereign leader of a sovereign nation and who sees that you put Britain first at all times? I can't really remember one in my lifetime. So we had a change of government, of course, last year, and now that baton that Cleverly was running with has been passed to Starmer, probably the worst man in Britain to pass it to. And here's what I think's going on. I think that the Tories saw that the UN was making these recommendations and advisory statements, and even though they were non-binding, the Tories thought, here's a way of showing our politically correct credentials. We'll show how much we love globalism and the UN by not just agreeing with them, but taking it a step further. Oh, the UN has made a non-binding piece of advice, a non-binding recommendation. You know what we're going to do? We're going to pretend that it was binding. We're going to act like it was binding. And we're going to show the world just what great internationalists we are and just how much we respect international law. And I'm sure all our leftist enemies will all nod their heads and they'll go, well, the Tories aren't so bad after all. I think that's all that's going on with the Tories, quite frankly. I think that's all that was going on with Truss and Cleverly. It's like, let's try to show our internationalist credentials and hopefully earn some brownie points from goodness knows who. However, once the baton got passed to Labour, then Labour, of course, are arch anti-imperialists. And if Labour could, they would divest Britain of all 14 of our British overseas territories and damn the consequences strategically. And so political correctness on behalf of the Tories has now got passed to Labour, who are the arch anti-imperialists who just want to kind of take away everything that Britain has in the world because that's just their ideology to do so. And even if that endangers Britain, they don't care. And if it pleases another country, then hey, that's even better for them. That's the way I see it, because there's no other explanation as to why Starmer would give sovereignty to Mauritius and then rent the islands back at the cost of £9 billion. You know, they talk about, and we're all angry with Labour for taking away the winter fuel allowance from pensioners. That was to save 1.4 billion. Okay, so he's going to save 1.4 billion by making your grandparents colder at the same time that he gives 9 billion to Mauritius completely unnecessarily. These are the people who are running our country. They're not fit to run our country. It's an absolute disgrace. So I hope you enjoyed that deep dive into what's happening with the Chagos Islands, with the British Indian overseas territory of which this is its flag.